As we mentioned earlier, Senate negotiators are running out of time to craft new gun laws before Congress leaves for its 4th of July recess. There have been 278 mass shootings in the U.S. this year. Let me repeat that, 278 mass shootings in the U.S. this year, according to Gun Violence Archive, a nonprofit research group. One of the responses that Congress is considering would expand access for treatment of mental illness. Chief medical correspondent Dr. Jon LaPook looked at the connection between mental illness and gun violence. He found that it's very complicated.
Possible active shooter at the top.
After every mass shooting,
There's still shots being fired.
we hear a common refrain.
People with mental illness are getting guns.
Our inability to deal with mental illness.
Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger.
People with mental illness are no more likely to commit acts of violence than people in the general population.
We spoke with the heads of both the American and Canadian psychiatric associations, Dr. Rebecca Brendel and Dr. Doug Ernest.
Compared to other places in the world, does the United States have a significantly increased rate of mental illness?
The rates of mental illness in the United States are really quite similar to the rates of mental illness in Canada and in other countries around the world.
Despite those similar rates of mental illness, rates of firearm violence in the United States and Canada are very different. In 2020, there were 277 firearm-related homicides in Canada, and more than 19,000 in the United States. Accounting for differences in population, the rate in the U.S. was more than 8 times higher.
So that's a really big difference that it cannot be attributable just to differences in the rate of mental illness.
What is causing somebody then to commit such a horrendous act as a mass shooting if it's not mental illness?
Saying that there's no mental illness does not mean that there's no psychological distress or there are no factors in an individual's life that might lead somebody to commit an act of violence.
There are a variety of factors relating to the risk of violence.
Doctors Brendel and Ernest say blaming mental illness for mass shootings diverts attention from the actual risk factors.
Social connectedness, substance use disorders, including acute intoxication.
Anger or resentment for having been mistreated or not fitting in.
People with a history of antisocial or violent behavior, of course. People who may find themselves in a situation that they perceive threat.
We do know that the best predictor of future act of violence is a past act of violence, but there's no one profile of an individual who commits an act of violence.
Both Dr. Brendel and Dr. Ernest say when people are in psychological distress, a key factor is having access to the means to commit violence.
During times of vulnerability, when people are on the edge of maybe or maybe not doing an act, access to lethal means is really a fateful factor.
In Canada, the estimated number of firearms for every 100 residents is 35. In the United States, it's 120.
We have more firearms than people in the United States. And so that difference really highlights the number one risk factor for gun violence, which is the presence of a firearm.
So how do you figure out how to prevent these terrible deeds?
We need to do systematic research about different kinds of firearm violence, including mass shootings, to help us understand what commonalities exist and what risk factors might be present.
And doing something about those risk factors means appreciating the complexity of the problem.
There's no one size fits all when we're talking about these relatively rare, although all too common incidences of mass violence.
Dr. Jon LaPook joins us right now. We heard in the piece that just because there's no mental illness, that doesn't mean there's no psychological distress. What's the difference and why is it important to point that out?
It may seem like you're splitting hairs saying there's a difference, but the mental health experts we spoke to feel so strongly that there's already such stigma attached to mental illness, they don't want to increase it. And they're saying, look, the research shows that the presence of mental illness is not a good way of predicting whether somebody is going to commit violence. Mm-hmm. So what is a good way? And that's where you get to the severe psychological distress. Mm-hmm. And you heard in the piece lots of different reasons for it. We all have seen in the profiles people who just reach a snapping point, a breaking point. They snap. It's very hard to figure out who those people are going to be. There are so many different causes.
Because it happens in a moment's time.
It can happen like that. It can be building up over time, but it's hard to predict who that is. There's a lot of discussions about what to do about that. But But for this piece today, the focus, the bottom line that I would like people to walk away with is that the mental health experts really want people, when there is one of these shootings, to not reflexively just blame mental illness.
I'm so
it's
glad
much
you
more
did this.
complicated than that.
So glad you did this piece, because it shows once again it's not the mental illness necessarily, it's the access to the guns.
Right.
Well, and you can have severe psychological distress with or without underlying mental illness. It's very complicated. We need more research.
Access to the guns and ideology as well.
Yeah, more guns, more gun deaths. It's pretty
He's
simple.
very
formula.
well done. And the numbers, 100 to 120, more guns than people. Thank you, Jon LaPook.
Thank you.